afternoon, everyone. A hearty welcome to Gettysburg College's Majestic Theater, or as we are fond to call it, the grandest small-town theater in America. And that is a tribute to Jeffrey. For those of you I haven't had the privilege of meeting, I am Bob Giuliano, the president of the college, and I am so pleased to see you all here today. If I may borrow a familiar but important phrase, I find it altogether fitting and appropriate that we should gather here in this historic venue, in this historic town, for what is sure to be and has been a very memorable Gettysburg Film Festival. It was just a little over a year ago that we hosted the first ever film festival dedicated solely to the timeless work of Ken Burns. For those of you who were in attendance then, I know that there are many of you who were, it was an extraordinary weekend featuring 35 hours of programming, and we attracted visitors from 28 states across the country. So, when Ken expressed an interest in returning to Gettysburg to deepen our examination of his transformative work, we were both thrilled and grateful. We were also just a little apprehensive given the high bar that was set last year. But because of the work of so many people, and I'll say more about that in a moment, people committed to the values of Ken's work, this year's programming has more than exceeded our highest hopes and expectations. It's programming that is engaging the entire Gettysburg community, not only here at the Majestic or at the college, but at the Adams County Historical Society and elsewhere across the borough. And it is programming that speaks to an ongoing commitment that the college and the community has to exploring topics that have special resonance and relevance given where we are. But before I go any further, I very much want to extend my deepest thanks to the people who have made this event possible. First, of course, to Ken and his truly remarkable team. We are honored that they see our community and our college as a place to ask essential questions about the future of our democracy. To our festival director, Jake Boritt, who stopped by my office a few years ago with a vision that has blossomed into this transformative experience, and one we are both committed to nurture and grow. Thank you, Jake. To our festival director and a Gettysburg College alumnus, Andrew Dalton, whose tireless work helped bring this festival to light. Thank you, Andrew. And to the college's exceptionally talented Majestic Theater staff, who every day makes the impossible seem so easy. Thank you all as well. And finally, to you all for being here today and being part of what is truly a remarkable experience for us, for this college, for this community, and I think more broadly for society. So thank you all for being with us and sharing this. We've had an incredible start to our festivities, including yesterday afternoon on our own campus, which if you're from out of town, just down the street, take a moment to visit. It is one of the most beautiful campuses in the country. And at the college, we talk a lot about making sure that we are providing our students with a consequential education, one that readies them to be effective leaders and active, informed, and engaged citizens. It's a commitment born very much of this land, and so it was especially important to us, and we were honored by the judgment that Ken and his longtime collaborator, Sarah, had in hosting a riveting question and answer session for our students yesterday on consequential elections. It was a primer for what you all will see in just a few minutes. The elections you will see discussed in a 35-minute clip reel, brought to life with the full nuance and emotion synonymous with all of Ken's work, in many ways serves as an invitation to all of us to reflect on the moments in which the American electorate stood at the crossroads and made a choice of who we are and what we believe in. It is an invitation. I would say more than that, it is an exhortation to get involved, to get our voices heard, and never to take for granted a government, quote, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Fissures within our communities and within our people as a nation have existed throughout our history. That is one of the points that Ken's film so powerfully makes. Yet the hallowed grounds we're gathered on today and that surrounds us here in Gettysburg serve as a poignant reminder of the cost of division and the value of reconciling when we should and standing firm when we must. As we examine the presidential elections that have tested us and defined us as citizenry, from President Lincoln's re-election amidst the Civil War to the more recent contests that have shaped our modern political landscape, may we remember Lincoln's charge to us, one we often sound to our students here at Gettysburg College, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work for which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Following today's film, you will have the opportunity to hear directly from Ken Burns himself and Susan Eisenhower. Susan is the granddaughter of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. She is an author, a consultant, a policy strategist with decades of work on national security issues. She is the chairman emerita of our Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College, which has locations both here in Gettysburg and in Washington, just a few steps away from the White House. Susan works with our students regularly, teaching them the lessons and skills of strategic leadership and so much more, and offering a perspective from the front seat of American history. It is sure to be an informing and engaging conversation. One final message before we begin. It's important to note that our agreement with Ken and his people prohibits any video or audio recordings of this afternoon's film or post-screening discussion. The footage was provided courtesy of Florentine Films and PBS, so thank you for that. With that, it is now my pleasure to present The Art of Ken Burns, Consequential and Elections. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Ken Burns and Susan Eisenhower, thank you for being back in the Majestic. Malice towards none.
Yeah, that second inauguration is great, and it's really reflective of a complexity in Lincoln that we were talking about a little bit last night, in that he sometimes can be. I remember in our jazz series, Wynton Marsalis said to me that sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing can be true at the same time. And anybody who's married, anybody who has children, trying to raise them, anybody who's just alive and breathing knows the fact of that, right? We tend to make things kind of hard and fast, black and white, and they're really not, and much more complicated. And so you see in his message to Congress, he says, fellow citizens, we cannot forget history, the fiery trial through which we pass, and then later on he's saying, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. This same speech, just a few lines separated, and he's the opposite. And in this one, it's so beautifully constructed that the beginning paragraph, as he's beginning the peroration of Finally Do We Hope, it's all kind of Old Testament. You want to keep this up for 500 years? We're here. We'll be here. Every drop of blood drawn with a lash, meaning slavery, of course, one drawn by the sword, meaning our resistance to your antiquated, dead forms. And then he pivots in 1 second to the New Testament. Finally do we hope, fervently do we pray. With malice towards none, with charity for all, and you get the sense of that he could contain all of these impulses, the steel that it took him to prosecute the war and to bring it to its conclusion, and also the generosity to understand that nothing was going to be the same without reconciliation and gestures of love, really. And he's startling for his ability to sort of get us and get also the complexity of us. It's not one thing or the other. As the House Divided speech says, we'll become one thing or the other. It's understanding that we're going to be both. And I think as the echoes of all of this sort of reverberate down the decades into the great, and to me, hugely tragic irony that the party of Abraham Lincoln would make such a sea change shift in 60 and 64 and 68 as to essentially swap votes with the Democratic Party is just so powerful, a sort of a proof of what that is. And the fact that you had somebody with the genius to be able to understand, as Whitman said, I contain multitudes, and Lincoln gets that at a basic and elemental level. He understands what it means is to hold everything together. That's why he's got a cabinet, as Doris Kearns Goodwin in her books, a team of rivals. Every one of his cabinet members think they'd be a better president than him,
Yeah.
And it's like, oops, look where the buck stops.
Well, and also the moment that speech, that second inaugural happens, the war is just about over. I mean, it's they know what's going to happen. It's just a matter of when at that point. But it's still this dark moment. I mean, really the darkest moment in American history, those years of killing each other. And he reaches out like that. And it's to your point this morning, it's us.
Yeah.
He's talking about us.
Yeah, he knows what has to happen, and that's where there's a kind of perspective that he has that I think very few Americans I've ever seen have had that kind of thing. FDR had it in a way, when the rendezvous with destiny speech, which is his acceptance of the inauguration at Soldiers Field the field in Philadelphia, where he accepted the nomination in 36. It's there are a few people who have come along who've understood and kind of tolerated the contradiction inherent in us, both the U.S. and us individually.
Well, yet you see, be it, Jefferson, Lincoln, getting to that position, i.e. President of the United States, is what happens to them, what they need to do, and what we as a country go through. And we're going through it again this year, obviously. But the necessity of democracy is to elect a leader, and that's often very bitter and divisive. But what is the purpose of, what does a leader have to do to overcome that? I mean, Susan, do you have?
Well, I must say, first of all, I want to say, Ken, I think it was so interesting to see. It's everything you put together there is so resonant for our times. And one point I'd like to make about that is I think it's never been more important. We don't have as many people studying history. And I hear constantly, all the time, the political end of the world is coming. But I think what you demonstrated is that America's gotten through a lot. So I'd like to ask you the question here about leadership. Many people today think we don't have the appropriate level of leadership for the challenges facing this country. So how do you see that in the context of these wonderful examples you gave in that last clip?
Well, I think it's all there. I mean, the whole range of humanity is happening back then. I mean, when somehow because of powdered wigs and the distance of time, the anachronistic, in some cases, speech, some of it sounds very exactly the way things are. Just take the election of 1800. I mean, it's, nobody's really exhibiting great leadership except Alexander Hamilton, who's kind of falling on his sword and realizes that he's choosing, as we say, the lesser of two evils, which, for the sake of the Republic, was a really good choice. Not so good for Alexander Hamilton, but it's not going to work out, the little differences with Aaron Burr, as everyone knows, but it's going to work out for the Republic. And he makes a choice, having to hold his nose and vote for somebody that he's, on a policy level, really quite opposed to. And so he shows a kind of leadership. I think other kinds of leadership that are going on now is that we live in a media culture where everything is happening so quickly, as it was then. I mean, the guy, Thomas Callender, whose name was mentioned and you see in the thing, that Jefferson hired to smear the Federalists, is disappointed when Jefferson's elected that he doesn't get the patronage job he thinks he's determined. So Callender writes an article called Dusky Sally, in which he tells the world that the president has been sleeping with his slave, a young slave girl on his plantation, and has in fact fathered children, a claim which is going to dog Jefferson for the rest of his life, a claim that historians have exerted a huge amount of energy trying to prove and refute, and which DNA conclusively proved at the end of the 1990s. That the Hemmings' offspring were in fact Jefferson. So there's a kind of strange politics, but you have a situation where sometimes you have great leaders who are uninterested in the credit. So people can pass legislation that say, if you're a blue state president, help a red state, and you don't care, right? And you can even have, in the case, right, what's going on, people voting against that legislation and then going back to their district to take credit for it. And there's a kind of interesting leadership that's been exerted in the face of all of the kind of craziness that you see in a Huey Long, which we saw earlier today, or even in the kind of, you can't imagine what it was like to go through those 36 ballots in the House of Representatives and just remaining deadlocked and deadlocked and deadlocked, and the kinds of anger and vitriol. But then you also go, wait a second, this guy is denied credentials. He's been to every Republican convention since 1940. This guy, a former catcher for the Pittsburgh Negro League team, has cigarette butts put out of him. Jackie Robinson's almost in a fist fight with a delegate. They're shouting down one of the major candidates for it. And you begin to realize, you know, everything's the same. Everything's the same.
Well, and that's, you know, a lack of civility in the system. I mean, and we see that time and time again, be it 1800 or 1960s. It's like, why is that so important to sort of believe in the system and also be civil within it and not violent, aggressive? And why?
Well, I think Sarah Botstein sat here this morning and really articulated something really well, just the idea of listening to the other. You don't have to agree with them, but the kind of gesture of civility that is suggested by that, you know, and almost all of the ages of our time have huge examples. And I think it's to Susan's point that, you know, we can get pessimistic and the sky is falling, and we just think because we are essentially ahistorical and we, you know, tend to burn our past behind us like rocket fuel, thinking that there's nothing that we need to know about the past in order to go forward, to go forward, to go forward. But when you think about the kind of incivility of Joseph McCarthy, or you think that Preston Brooks, who is a South Carolina congressman, goes over to the Senate and beats nearly to death Charles Sumner, an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, to death, and that his supporters sent him thousands of replacement canes. Like, do this again. And we're sort of somehow, you know, we're shocked by what we hear going on now. But this is human nature. That does not change. And what we have to do is figure out a way in our discourse to select for that part of human nature that represents the best of us. You know, what we would hope would be for the betterment of ourselves and our posterity, the better angels of our nature.
It seems to me that the thing that Lincoln did so well was to raise us up. It seems to me also that what we're really not taking into account is people's fear. I think what is dividing this country is fear.
I agree.
Fear about the future, fear that we don't have the leaders in place to help us enter a new world. And we're concentrating on it more now because of artificial intelligence. It may be human beings against the machines before this is all over, but
we know who wins that one, right?
We know who wins that one, exactly.
Hal, close the Bombay doors.
Very good. Very good. But so to what extent do you think that fear is at the basis of these deep divisions in our country?
Yes, I think that's really smart. As I told you in the green room, I had the great privilege and opportunity of having a conversation in front of an audience a few nights ago with President Obama, and to ask him. And I was talking a little bit, and I feel that I was maybe holding down the Chicken Little side of things about the current situation, that we had three great crises before us: the Civil War, the Depression, the Second World War. But in those, we had free and fair elections, we had peaceful transfer of power, there was an independence of the judiciary that just went without saying. And, you know, weren't we in a new and more modern whatever? And he said, as far as I remember, and I thought you knew something about this, Burns, the Civil War, the Civil War killed 750,000 people. But he spoke then, I thought, really sincerely and poignantly about what you're talking about. This notion of fear and the rapidity of change and the questions about, as globalization takes place, as new media comes, as social media comes to dominate, in such a short time, there have been sea changes. There were times when he was on the wrong side, or at least had not yet shown his cards about gay marriage, and his vice president kind of went out ahead and said, oh, we're for it, you know? And then all of a sudden that changed and everything changed, and nobody could have predicted 2 years before that in 2 years there would be that. So there are many people who are struggling to accept a lot of things, that globalization, what it's done to change in jobs, and that sort of thing. Of course, the way social media isn't, I would say, you know, that it's that you know, if you've ever been in a room of teenagers or adults and everybody's on their device, nobody's together at that moment. They're all someplace else, plugged into something else, and that social media, that dislocation, that sense that all of this is being controlled by other forces can turn you, in that fear, susceptible to the authoritarian's arguments. You're right, it's not your fault, it's their fault, and to make a them out of whatever the enemy might be, you know, and it's hard to sort of unring some bells in which you've supported the compromises through, you know, hard fought for a long time through the history of the American legislation. But if you have run out of an enemy, say, at the end of the 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you make the sitting Democratic president in the early 90s the enemy, and then by extension the entire party, and so demonize them, all of a sudden there's no room for compromise, none whatsoever. And then when that happens, then things get stalled, and then you make an enemy of your neighbor. And you're at that place where so many societies have that critical mass of wondering, as I think many people do, of whether, you know, as Kennedy quoting, Robert Kennedy quoting Yates in '68 after the Tet Offensive, whether the center can hold, you know, whether things fall apart. You know, mere entropy is loosed upon the world, is the Yates poem.
And along those lines, it referenced the social media, how we've created technology and media and interaction that isolates us.
Yes.
And you're seeing that among opinions where it's, and how do, you know, as this technology evolves, as we evolve, as the robots are coming, what do leaders, what is the president, looking at the Constitution, presidential leadership, what are we looking for? I mean, we need leaders like Lincoln and so forth, but what do they do in a day when it's...
Well, you know, they may be around. It's just that all of that social media doesn't select for that sort of thing anymore. I mean, you know the thing for the last 30 or 40 years, that if it bleeds, it leads.
Sure.
Right? So, I mean, we're just out of the Easter season, right? It's all about the crucifixion, right? It's literally, if it bleeds, it leads. Nothing about the teaching. What about the teaching? You claim to be a Christian? Then maybe you go down to the border and wash the feet of an immigrant that's coming. Yeah. I mean, isn't that what Jesus said? And do we get distracted by his murder? Right? So I think that we aren't, we sort of think, we lament that there aren't any leaders. We just don't select for looking for them in any way. So the person who is saying the most outrageous thing on social media gets our kids' attention or our attention or the public's attention, and that's what leads. And I think what happens is that we have to begin to trust some instincts within ourselves, that we're all citizens, we all have agency. Obviously, to vote is the greatest privilege and honor, unless you wish to be a subject again, and to vote for what's actually true and not part of disinformation. I mean, look, the South, when McClellan's nominated, you see what that is? That's the beginning of disinformation. I yelled out in the green room last night, "Hacker!" You know, as they're you know, spreading lies and misinformation in the North about Lincoln and that. There's no difference from anything that's happening now. It's just on such a mega scale that we have to figure out. Our response to it has to be as measured and as disciplined, but as appropriate as necessary, so that in all cases the tortoise wins and the hare gets tired and goes to sleep. right?
Well, you talk about the size, the volume of this misinformation or potential misinformation or just opportunity for distraction. But it's also the immediacy of it.
Yes.
And this is what I think many Americans are deeply concerned about. They're concerned about it in other parts of the world too, but there are more restrictions on a lot of the social media. So how do you see this element of time playing into questions of stability and consequential elections? Because things happen in an instant now, and they don't just happen in an instant, but then they volumize, if that's a word, into something that is so much larger than
Yeah.
any one person can refute or to take
It's such a
back.
complicated dynamic, Susan. I think, this is really at the heart of it. The lie goes around the world 3 times before the truth can get started, and by that time, you're onto your next distractive thing. And just as Lincoln has that wonderful phrase about, we might as well be in Russia where they make no pretense of democracy, This is Lincoln talking about Russia. And the fact that the agents of the former Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and North Korea and Iran are working assiduously to elect one candidate over the other because they believe that that candidate will be more sympathetic to their authoritarian stuff is just an amazing thing. And you don't have to actually counter each one of the things. You just have to figure out, I wish to unlearn the habits of the lazy learning and reinstitute what it is. I mean, when I go around and people ask, I just say, just read 2 or 3 newspapers. That's all you need to do, right? Just read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. They'll reflect the range of political views within the United States, but they all have a cadre of journalists that when you're not on the editorial page, are really great. Can you discern some bias or some subjectivity? Of course, everybody is like that. But do that, or watch on a broadcast network a nightly news where you're getting this sense of the other stuff. But most people are down rabbit holes, absolutely sure that Democrats through a pizza outlet in DuPont Circle run a pedophile ring that wants to kidnap children and suck their blood. I mean, it's okay to say, I disagree with you, bleeding heart people, but to have gotten that far that you've made compromise a dirty word, and that you get unelected if you say, gee, I think the emperor has no clothes, or you're absolutely wrong about that, or whatever. I mean, if you think about what's happening right now, it's really quite stunning.
Well, and then where we're going, that by depending on your measure, census and so forth, that by 2040 or so, we're going to be a minority white country for the first time since 1776 or before, and then minority Christian as well. And how will our democracy adapt when there's not a dominant majority? I mean, there's no prediction to be accurate, but how do we
reverse it? Let me ask you this thing. Then.
Yeah.
Let me just reverse it and say, so therefore the answer to those mileposts should be to install a Christian nationalist thing that forbids the practice of other religions? I don't think you'd agree with that, right?
No.
I mean, it's pretty simple. Kids get this really well. Just read Dr. Seuss's Sneetches, and some people have stars on theirs and others don't, and then they try to figure out how to get stars on, and they get stars on, and then they try, the original Sneetches try to take the stars off. It's a huge racial, religious metaphor, and it's right there, and kids get it faster than adults do.
I'd like to ask you some questions in this long history that you've researched and chronicled in such magnificent ways. Tell me how you feel about certain parts of the Constitution. People are very worried that because of the Electoral College and other things, that we, on the one hand, we are a democratic republic. On the other hand, we're becoming more parliamentary-like every day, in my view. But still, it turns out that only 5 states or 6 states or whatever really elect a president. Some of the stories that you've told in your filmmaking have dealt with Electoral College challenges. This seems to be a persistent problem. I'm not forgive me for that, a persistent issue
Yeah.
over the period of our republic. So how do we deal with this now, since this may well be one of the most contentious things we're facing now and in the future?
I mean, the
Is
implication...
that too political a question?
No, I think it's right. The last election was decided by more than 7 million votes in favor of the person who was elected. But it was actually literally under 100,000 votes distributed between those states, which has to do with the Electoral College, which was in and of itself an anxiety that the founders were trying to reverse engineer all of their worries that they could think of, like, what are we going to do if this happens? How do we handle this? And the 51 or so that Hamilton wrote and the 29 that Madison wrote, John Jay wrote a Federalist paper. They're all trying to figure out, but what if this situation happens? Don't we need this? These are sort of the operating manuals, and they're figuring it out. And it now looks in retrospect like the Electoral College was a big problem, that it's come back to bite us, that you can't
It was a big issue in 1960.
And it was a big issue
Yeah.
in 1962 as well. The thing is that since 2000, only 2004, when George W. Bush won re-election, did he win the popular vote as well as the electoral vote. And everything else from 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, and we assume 2024, whichever way it goes, that the Democratic Party will have a significant, Hillary won the popular vote by 3.5 million. Nobody in history has received more votes for presidency than Joe Biden, and won by 7+ million. It's a real problem if, in fact, it's gotten down to a few counties in a few states where you're exerting your will, and then that makes them potentially even more susceptible to the kind of misinformation and disinformation that are there. The idea, though, that you would have any kind of political will to change this, it's not in the interest of one party to do this, and it's not in the interest of either party in the short term to sort of have uniform redistricting that avoids the gerrymandering that's named after a Massachusetts politician from the 18th century. This is where it comes from, meaning if we just, carve this out down this street and then down this avenue, and then this whole western part of the state will have a district that will be helpful for us, that if we had more uniform. But there's not going to be a political will to change that, because otherwise one party becomes instantaneously irrelevant.
Well, if I may also repeat a story that we discussed in the green room, I'm perfectly intrigued that this time last year, and
this is the room where it happens, by the way. Right. And sorry.
No, you're right. So I want to bring you into this story. A year ago, and I should have checked the figures before coming here, but a year ago, Gallup poll revealed that for the first, I can't say for the first time, but certainly recently, that independent voters outnumbered both Republicans and Democrats put together.
I don't think it's put together, but I know
No,
that,
it was. A year ago it was.
That independents, people who are registered as immigrant, not identifying, but registered as slightly more than either party.
Just as a clarification, I did talk to the head of Gallup polls because I was so intrigued about this. From what I understand, the reason I say independent voters is not every state requires you
that's right.
To actually, there's a registration for it. But the point is that this enormous block of voters are independent. And it is, in essence, a decision on the part of people who become a registered independent, if they're allowed to register, is not to become a Republican or a Democrat. How, in the long sweep of history, does that look to you? Do you see a period of history emerging where one party falls away and another one is recreated? Or
well, this is, if our history is any guide, I bought a poster the other day. It was actually two posters, which I had framed in my office, and it basically shows the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as these two snakes intertwining and sort of switching ideologies. as we went along.
Where
And
do we
other
get that
parties
poster?
and other parties, I'll send it to you. And other parties coming and going, right? So the Republican Party is born, as I said earlier, in a schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854 out of the ashes of the Whig Party. And the idea was that there was a deep, deep frustration that had been manifested in the Whigs for decades that the country was essentially ruled in the presidency, which was occupied by Southerners in support of slavery for most of those presidents up to that point, and that the Congress had been dominated by Southerners who would not entertain the notion that slavery might be morally wrong, especially in a country born under the idea that all men are created equal, asterisk, the guy who wrote it owned hundreds of human beings. And so the Republican Party is born to be a bulwark against that, to argue for the rights of the small farmer and the small businessman, and against the essential oligarchs that the plantation interest represented, who weren't going to let go of their most valuable property, which in 1861 was 4 million other American citizens who were counted for the purposes of apportionment and gave them their political power as 3/5 of a person. So you've got this unbelievable moral dilemma, which the Republican Party then adds as one of its principal things, the abolition of slavery. And now, by the time you get to the Jackie Robinson thing, and Jackie points out, to your point, that it was wrong if the Democrats now, since Franklin Roosevelt, expected all blacks to vote the same way, and that black people should reserve their votes, be independent, to see which candidate would serve their interests the best. And he remained as a kind of conservative party of Lincoln. As you heard, Rachel, her family has already made the switch, understanding, that as the Republican Party abandoned its civil rights platforms after the Civil War and abandoned Reconstruction, which was not a bad period, it was a good period, its collapse is the bad period. As they looked the other way, as white supremacy brutally reimposed itself over the former Confederacy, as they watched the Republican Party be the business of business, as the Republican presidential candidates of the 1920s insisted it was, you saw many moving to the Democratic Party, which you would never think of, because the Democratic Party is the party of resistance to that in the South. So there's this strange coalition that happens until the two elections that we told. I think it's just an amazing story of us. So yes, you could see a party dying out of just its lack of ideas or the absurdity of it, and then some other party coming. There's been a Union Party, maybe there's another Union Party, or there's a Unity Party, or there's something else that offers a new set of values to sort of counteract a Democratic Party that's going along and being rather...
So why don't either of these parties speak to this vast group in the middle?
Well, because the election is still about... we also have, in addition to the Electoral College, and I thought you'd bring it up too, is primaries, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that can be more easily changed. But what's happened is that winning a primary requires you, particularly in the Republican Party, to go to the most extreme position that you can get, to the extreme right. It's true to some extent in the Democratic Party, but not as much, but it's there. And so what happens is you begin to select for the people who don't even speak to the middle, whereas, people have always tended to be, Democrat or Republican, fairly centrist. And there's always been parts of it, and they've been important parts on both sides that have suggested ideas that have contributed to a mainstream consensus centrist point of view. But that's not happening. And so when you realize, as every political operative in America realizes, there are suburbs of Philadelphia, suburbs of Pittsburgh, suburbs of Phoenix, Atlanta, Detroit, and Milwaukee that will decide the next election. You are just going after them, and whatever it takes. And by the way, the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians and the Chinese know this too. And so they are very much into telling people, oh, your vote has already been recorded. Thank you for voting this, so you don't have to go, right? And there's lots of stuff going on like this. Or they're saying, did you know, Susan, that in your town is this guy named Jake Boritt that eats children, right?
I
And, you
suspected
know,
that, actually.
and-
Yeah.
They're delicious.
Right. In the Addams Family, somebody says, says to Gomez, "Oh, you're such a lady killer," and he says, "Acquitted."
Yeah. Well, how do you follow that up?
Yeah, there's no answer to that. But we're in Adams County, so this is the Addams Family, and I was just trying to work it all back to the
Let's hear it for Adams County.
1D, not 2.
1D. Well, yeah, but it's still, again, the misinformation, really the hate. And I mean, I think that Jefferson and Adams election is so profound because we know where their relation ends up. And so there's where we can go back to really, I mean, Washington is essentially uncontested, is the president, and then willingly steps down. We talked about that earlier. And so then you have this fight to be his successor, and it leads to this, almost the end of the republic, I think it's fair to say. at the
Well,
moment.
Adams, like Trump, did not go to the inauguration of his successor. He fully assumed that he would be given and deserved to have the 2 terms that Washington had had, and it didn't happen because of this election. And that threw a monkey wrench. But I think Jefferson's response to this is so great because my whole mantra has been Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, human nature never changes. And he says there is something new under the sun. And so I think that the American, it's telling you, it seems to me that there's a possibility of change and that the American experiment was the first time in human history we were creating citizens and we are no longer subjects. This is going to take a lot of work. All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. We tend to put up with dictators because we can, and that's the story of human history, but no, we're something different. And I think you gave the key, Jake, in that we know what happens, you said, to their relationship. And what Jake means is that these 2 men on opposite sides of a developing political spectrum who would be considered Democrats or Republicans or conservative or progressive or whatever, and they don't really apply because of some of the states' rights stuff of Jefferson sounds very conservative, and some of the, the Federalist stuff of Adams sounds very progressive and strong federal government. But they are bitter, bitter enemies, and he is so upset that Adams does not go to the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. But they write to each other. They're encouraged to write to each other, and they begin one of the most beautiful correspondence. And so it harks back to what Sarah Botstein said earlier when we were together, that when you begin to listen, these 2 old warriors, they die on the same day. Same day, July 4th, 1826, which is the 50th anniversary. And they actually spend the last several years of their lives discussing this thing that they had created, which I wish all of us could realize that we could also claim. They had created the United States of America. And that's something so precious and so valuable that it's more important to put aside the policy differences that you might have with one another in order to preserve these small r Republican, small d democratic values that unite us. It is interesting to see the political landscape right now that is so much about the anger and the hatred and the vermin and the subhuman. No human being is subhuman, but how we get to a place and forget to look at the people who are saying, I wish to put my country before my party. I wish to put this before something else. And to do what Jefferson and Adams did at the end of their life was to reconcile as friends, but to reconcile also and give us the example of how you might come together as people, even though they still retained vast differences in policy. They found more that they shared in common. And that's really true. Other countries are stunned until recently that the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party was like this. And they were saying, we have 16 parties, and they're from here to here, if you're in Italy, from fascist to communist. And and they go, why are you guys arguing over this tiny little band of the center? Now it's a little bit wider and a little more difficult, but it does not mean, and the thing that was most impressive about President Obama, and I know you're friends, Susan, with the president, he was sanguine. As he was rebuking my sort of Chicken Little stuff, he was also sanguine that we have been through this before. We got through the election of 1800. We got through the election of 1800. We had an election in 1864, right? Things survived out of 60 and 64, and we have many others when we could, start the screen going and do, 1912. You could do 1932, 1936, 1940. These are all consequential elections. 2000. Amazing things have happened, and we can get through it. And I think it's because we are a country that has agreed to cohere to words. We know when we were founded, we know where we were founded, and we know why we were founded. And all that's just the North Star, actually northeast star, Philadelphia, July 4th next year, right?
And so we're sort of coming down to the end of our conversation, but I think again, we're looking deep, really almost to the beginning of the Republic, and we see it's there, it's hateful, but there's also this joint sense of mission, I think, almost
They're all worried about that we got to do this right. I mean, the Articles of Convention didn't work, and so they were trying to figure out with the Constitution. And Jefferson's off in Paris, and he's anxious. He's writing to Madison, what if somebody loses an election and doesn't want to give up power? What are we going to do with that sort of unscrupulous person? Meanwhile, Hamilton's writing and saying, and what if somebody, some unprincipled person should ride the storm and direct the whirlwind? What will we do, And how do we guard against this? We're constantly in the process of becoming, right? It's a more perfect union. It's in pursuit. The key word is pursuit of happiness, and that's not things in a marketplace of objects, but lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. Every single founder, if we could bring them back and ask them what capital H happiness meant, it meant that. So the thing, to Susan's extraordinary point, if we learn about this history, if we learn ever more about it, then, as Lincoln said, we will save our country.
Well, there you go. That was fantastic. Ken Burns, Susan Eisenhower, guys. Thank you.